On June the 2nd, 2011, Bung left her home in Boronia to walk to school at about 8:30 in the morning.
In this particular case, it was a crime involving a young schoolgirl of tender years, taken off the street in a Melbourne metropolitan suburb, a place where most people would reasonably expect to be safe, Boronia, in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, without a trace.
The fact is we don't know what happened to Bung. We can assume she may have been abducted. We have had no information with regard to sightings of Bung that we can verify since she left home that day.
If there's anyone out there that knows anything, we want our daughter back. It's 3 years now. We're all hurting. Somebody come forward, let us know what's going on. Somebody out there knows something.
The anxiety was already fairly palpable in the community anyway, because parents, we don't know what's happened to her. And as the weeks went by, the anxiety levels increased.
We're also hopeful that the person or persons who know what's happened will come forward and give this family the peace that they need.
We still believe that she's coming home. We have to believe that. We can't believe anything else.
Siriyakorn Siriboon, who had become more commonly known by her nickname, Bung, was born on December 30th, 1997. Bung Siriboon was the second child of her parents, after her sister, Siriporn, who also had a nickname of her own, Pong. Pong was 7 years older than Bung, but the two had a close, sisterly relationship. The two sisters lived in Thailand, in the Ubon Ratchathani province with their mother and father. However, when Bung was really young, her parents would divorce, and both daughters stayed with their mother, Vanidda. In 2004, Vanidda, the mother, met an Australian man named Fred Pattison while she was vacationing in Melbourne. After meeting, the two decided to keep in touch, even after Vanidda returned to her daughters in Thailand. Coincidentally, Fred Pattison, who had grown up in Queenscliff, Victoria, had become enamored with Thai culture over the years. He had visited the nation in the mid-1990s, and he loved the culture. In 2006, Fred moved to Thailand to be closer to Vanidda, Nid, as he called her. While there, he got to learn more about her two daughters. Over the next several months, as his relationship with Nid blossomed, he became more of a father figure to the two. After all, their birth father was almost entirely out of the picture, and Fred took a liking to the two girls. Soon enough, he referred to them as his daughters, and they began referring to him as their father. At around this time, Fred and Vanidda got married, and she officially took on his last name, Pattison. They decided to start a business, and they began enjoying their time together living in Thailand. However, within 2 years of moving to Thailand, the business that Fred and Vanidda Pattison had started was failing. So, with very few remaining options, Fred decided to move back to Australia, specifically Victoria, and he accepted a job at a factory near Melbourne. He moved there ahead of time, but the rest of the young family was able to join him later on, in 2008. When the family moved to Australia, Pong was 17 years old, and Bung was only 10. They spoke very little English at the time, but they were hoping that they would be able to pick up the language and culture quickly, and acclimate themselves in no time. They planned to put the two girls through Australian schools, which they believed would give them a leg up, should they decide to move back to their native Thailand. As the girls went through school, Fred and Nid were hoping to pay down their debts, and then retire to Thailand in their relative youth. It was a pretty honest and earnest plan, but it would require some hard work and some sacrifices from the family over the next couple of years. They moved to Boronia, a small suburb of Melbourne, in southern Victoria. The town itself was named after the colorful plants, which grew naturally throughout the area. Boronia, which is north of Dandenong and west of a large forested area, is seen as an alright area. It's a decent middle-class suburb with a low crime rate, but also features a couple of problems endemic of many similar suburbs. The area has a noticeable drug problem, especially in the area around the Boronia train station, which was pretty close to the area where the family was moving to. Fred and Nid bought a home along Elsie Street, which was just a short walk away from the schools that Bung and Pong would be attending in the near future. This home, which the family would live in for the next several years, was a pretty cozy little home which they turned into their own little oasis. The family planted many trees and shrubs around the home, and began tending to a colorful garden which gave their home some noticeable life in the like-minded suburb. Fred Pattison continued to work his factory job, which kept him away from the home during nights. Nid accepted a part-time job, which was mostly menial, but helped her provide for the family. They were preparing for a nice and quiet little life for themselves, which they hoped would provide safety and stability for their 2 daughters. The home that the family purchased, along Boronia's Elsie Street, was less than a 10-minute walk away from the school that both girls would be attending. As Fred stated, quote, "I wanted Bung to grow up feeling safe, and there was no reason why she shouldn't feel safe walking to school. There were always lots of people around, particularly in the morning. Kids going to school, commuters driving to work. The main bus route is near here, and there are 2 arterial roads. I certainly never had any issues." Before Bung could begin attending school in the area, she had to first undergo an extensive English learning course upon moving to Australia. Soon thereafter, though, she began attending a nearby school, Boronia Primary. She entered the school as a 4th grader, and was seated next to another girl named Damai Hillard. At first, the 2 girls did not get along. As Damai put it, quote, "I really wanted to get to know her, but I think she found me annoying at first. She put a ruler down the middle of the desk, so I couldn't cross over to her side." Bung, who was still very shy with new people, was still warming up to this new country and new language, so she seemed very withholding. But the more that her and Damai interacted, the closer they grew. Eventually, they became best friends. Damai Hillard later described Bung as, quote, "a happy person, with a very kind heart and so caring. I was bullied a lot, and she was the only person who stood up for me. She could be quite shy with new people, but once she got to know them, she was very outgoing. She was always ready to talk to people and try new things. She was just so easy to be around." Bung quickly obtained a reputation for being a great student, who excelled at anything to do with math. She was always on time and punctual, and she was rarely absent, if at all. She was described by almost all of her teachers as being very shy and polite, which she often chalked up to her traditional Thai upbringing. Over the next couple of years, Bung and Damai remained close friends. They continued to bond over their love of several things, but namely, they loved to dance and sing. When the 2 girls finished up with primary school, they excitedly moved their adventures to the next level at Boronia Heights College, a high school that was also incredibly close to Bung's home. The 2 often met at a park nearby Bung's home, and they would walk to school together every morning. While at Boronia Heights College, the 2 girls expanded their friend group and became friends with some other girls in their grade. One of the girls, named Layla Preston, was a classmate with Bung during grade 7. She described Bung as being, quote, "just so bubbly and friendly, always making people laugh, always wanting to have fun." Now, as they became teenagers, the girls continued to bond over their love of dance and song. Together, they all began rehearsing for talent show performances, and Bung became a huge fan of the music genre known as K-pop. In fact, her parents were later surprised to learn that she had been teaching herself Korean because of this obsession. However, Bung's one true love is one that I'm sure many teenage girls of that time period are familiar with. None other than the Biebs himself, Justin Bieber. Layla Preston, Bung's classmate and friend, recalled this fondly during an interview sometime later. Quote, "She absolutely loved Justin Bieber. She had a crush on him, and she'd always listen to his songs." From what I've been able to learn about Bung, it seems like she was as normal of a teenage girl as you can imagine. She loved to sing, and dance, and laugh, and giggle with her friends. She mostly kept to herself, was well regarded by all of her teachers and fellow students. She was considered shy by those that hardly knew her, and considered goofy by those that knew her well. Surprisingly, unlike many kids her own age, Bung actually loved being at school. It was often her main social outlet, and she loved being among kids her own age. Her friend Layla said as much. Quote, she loved school, and being at school with her friends. In her personal life, Bung Siriboon had no real issues to speak of. Despite the age difference between her and her sister, the two were close. Not exactly quote-unquote friendly, as I'm sure any teenage girl could tell you, but they were loving in their own way. She was close with her stepfather, whom she had grown to consider her father over the last 5 years. But the person that Bung had the closest relationship to was with her mother, Vanidda. Bung was the baby of the family, and was the apple of her mother's eye. Demai Hillard, Bung's closest and best friend, spent countless hours over at the family's house, and recalled the dynamic seeming very normal. Quote, she loved her sister, and she loved her parents. She fought with her mum sometimes, but just over the normal teenage stuff, like not wanting to clean up the dishes. Despite having a personality that was very outgoing and active with her friends, Bung was described as being a bit of an introvert. She was a kid that enjoyed sleeping in her own bed at night, and enjoyed having her own space. Her stepfather, Fred, described her as a quote-unquote older soul in an interview, and I think that description fits her perfectly. She was active on social media, but had no history of any boyfriends, and did not seem to have reached a point in her life where that had become a pressing matter. After all, going into June of 2011, she was only 13 years old, and entering the time of her life where she would figure out who she was as a person. June 2nd, 2011 started off like any other day. It was a Tuesday, right at the brink of an Australian winter. The forecast was a bit chilly, right around 15 degrees Celsius, which is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It was raining off and on throughout the morning. At around the same time that the house started stirring for the day, stepfather Fred Pattison returned home from his evening shift at the factory. He laid down to sleep in a back bedroom, while Bung finished her breakfast of egg rice soup. Bung was wearing her regular school uniform as she prepared to step out the front door. Her uniform, a blue and white striped dress with white socks and black Dunlop volley shoes, was complemented by a dark blue zip-up school jacket and blue patterned backpack. A little bit after 8 o'clock in the morning, Bung bid adieu to her mother and stepped out the front door to head to school. The timing is somewhat disputed, with estimates varying between 8:15 and 8:25. However, we do know that a neighbor would spot Bung down the street at a little before 8:30 that morning, so it fits in roughly with the rest of the timeline. This neighbor, whose dog barked through a closed window at Bung, made a mental note of the girl walking to school along Elsie Street. This neighbor noted that she was walking toward Albert Avenue, which would put her on the same path she took every day to school. This usual route took her down Elsie Street, toward Albert Avenue. At the intersection, Elsie Street came to an end, and Bung would take a short right on Albert Avenue, before taking a left at Harcourt Road. There, she would walk halfway down the block, before taking a left on Monco Street, a cul-de-sac with a dead end. However, at the dead end on Monco Street lay the back gate for Bung's school, the Boronia Heights College. This walk, which normally took Bung about 10 minutes, is a little over 1 kilometer in length. Because it was raining that morning, several kids in the area were getting a ride to school from their parents. So there weren't many people out and about that morning, such as Bung's friend, Demai, who normally met with Bung along the walk. Police would later note that a witness spotted Bung along Harcourt Road at around 8:55 that morning. This sighting, which has never been confirmed, indicates that this normally 10-minute walk had taken Bung much longer than usual. However, this sighting would also put Bung within 500 feet of the school's back gate. This sighting has been disputed because, despite being just down the road from the Boronia Heights College that Bung attended, she never made it to school that day. In the distance between her family's home on Elsie Street and the high school she attended, something happened. Bung Siriboon did not show up for school on June 2nd, 2011, which teachers thought was very unlike her. It was considered out of character for someone as punctual and reliable as she was, so staff at the school just listed her as being sick. That afternoon, at around 4 p.m., Bung's best friend, Demai Hillard, called the family home, hoping to get in touch with Bung. She wanted to remind her that they were playing football the next day, and to come prepared. Bung's parents, who answered the call, asked Demai why she had not just told Bung while they were at school together. This is when Fred and Nid Pattison discovered that their 13-year-old daughter had not been at school that day. Fred and Nid drove up to Boronia Heights, where they spoke to the school staff. They found out from school principal Kate Harnetti that Bung had indeed been absent that day, and that teachers just assumed she was ill and would be back the next day or so. School policy did not require a call home on the student's first absence, which this was for Bung. Upon hearing this, the Pattisons drove up to the nearby Knox police station, where a statement was taken by police. However, police urged the family to try and reach out to some of Bung's friends and other family members in an effort to cover every base. Fred and Vanidda returned home, where they discovered that Bung did not have her cell phone with her. This was actually pretty usual, as she complied with the school's rules about electronic devices, and almost always left it at home. Bung's parents began reaching out to all of the friends they knew of, including Demai Hillard, Bung's best friend. She later recalled getting the call from Bung's parents. Quote, "I just sat there on the floor, crying. I gave them phone numbers of everyone I could think of. It was so scary. I was so sad and shocked. It didn't seem real." Layla Preston, another of Bung's close friends, received a call that afternoon from a mutual friend of theirs. Word was beginning to spread. Quote, "She said, 'Bung's missing.' I'll never forget those words. I just started bawling. Then I was calling all my friends and telling them, 'Bung's missing. We don't know where she is.'" Fred and Nid Pattison spent the rest of the evening calling around to everyone that they could think of, hoping they'd find out that Bung had been expressing some teenage rebellion for once. But as the hours began ticking away, the fear refused to leave their gut. They forgot to eat anything that evening, and they struggled to get some sleep, restlessly fearing that the worst-case scenario for every parent had finally happened to them. On Friday, June 3rd, the parents of Bung Siriboon returned to the Knox police station along Burwood Highway. They wanted to check in and see if the police had any other options for their search, which had been fruitless so far. Following this early morning meeting with the local police, Fred and Nid began to canvass the area and started hanging up missing persons posters in the area around their home. Fred Pattison, Bung's stepfather, took leave from work for the foreseeable future, and he was spotted that afternoon, hanging up missing persons flyers around the Boronia Mall. Their simple family functions began to fade away, instead becoming overwhelmed by a single desire: to find Bung. In fact, Fred later told the press, quote, "I don't think we ate for a week." News reports of Bung's disappearance finally hit the news that Friday afternoon, and the public became well aware of the missing teenager. In the wake of this news, the family was faced with a lot of public attention, and with it came not only offers of support or encouragement, but the fears that followed the parents of every missing child. This was the possibility of something terrible happening to them. Because of this, it became obvious to Fred Pattison that he was going to have to be the one to face the media, and to stand strong for the family. Bung's older sister wasn't ready to deal with a tragedy like this, and their mother, Vanidda, was an emotional wreck in the absence of her youngest child. So Fred became the face of the family, and he became the one that had to help coordinate efforts to find Bung, as well as speak to the eager press that came to ask questions. Quote, "Friends and workmates were dropping in and organizing search parties, and people were setting up Facebook pages and bringing us food. There were TV cameras everywhere, and reporters sitting out front and chasing you down the street. We were walking around in circles, in shock, trying to cope. I was beside myself, but I had to be strong to support my wife and daughter. It would have been so easy to fall apart, but instinct kicked in. It was like, we've got to find her. What do we do?" The word was out. Siriyakorn Siriboon, more commonly known by her nickname, Bung, was missing. She was a 13-year-old girl, originally from Thailand, who stood around 154 centimeters tall, about 5 feet. She was thin, with Asian features, a tan complexion, long dark hair, and brown eyes. Police almost immediately started receiving tips, and the mass amounts of them made it a mess for police to have to sift through. as they started going through the mass amounts of phone calls and email tips that they were receiving. Investigators started off far closer to home. They began asking questions about Bung's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance. Unsurprisingly, everything had been relatively normal. She was a normal kid who had seemed very stable and happy over the span of several months, with no major incidents. Because of this, police almost immediately ruled out the possibility of Bung being a runaway. Her social media accounts were gone through, including 3 Facebook accounts and a MySpace page that was still active, in which her listed age was 27. However, police were able to exhaustively go through these pages one by one, and they found nothing out of the ordinary. She had not been communicating with anyone that would warrant suspicion. That made it very unlikely that her absence was planned by a predator that she met online, and that theory was quickly eliminated as well. Bung's stepfather, Fred Pattison, openly admits that he was one of the first people that police suspected. He has never shied away from that fact. Actually, he welcomed it. He wanted police to thoroughly investigate him in order to clear him and move on to other possibilities as soon as possible. He even stated, quote, "The father's always the first suspect. They searched me, searched the house, all the cupboards, the roof. They even searched under the house because somebody said I'd been digging. I was under investigation for a long time. People were saying, oh, it's got to be him. It did not worry me. I've got nothing to hide." Bung's family members were cleared as suspects shortly after her disappearance, and John Potter, a detective inspector that worked on the case, said as much a while later, quote, "The family are grieving for their daughter. They are desperately in need of information. They are confident she will be okay and she will come home." The family, especially Vanidda, Bung's mother, began to draw further from their Buddhist faith in the weeks and months to come, as the investigation began to expand outwards. They would find that faith questioned over the span of time, but they have never lost it. By the end of June 2011, police made it known that they believed Bung Siriboon had been abducted. As such, they were shifting their investigation to focus on that more stark reality. Detectives and investigators with the homicide squad began working the case, and talks of a full-on task force began making the rounds during those winter months. Police had already been conducting searches for Bung in the weeks after her disappearance, including any evidence that might have pointed to foul play. They had created a thorough timeline of when she had likely gone missing, and went over the regular route that she walked to school, which is where she had likely gone missing from. This is when they found the witness statements, which put her on the path to school early that June morning, but they were unable to find any proof of wrongdoing. It was as if Bung had disappeared into thin air on her way to school. Police began conducting searches of the area to the east, which included large swaths of parkland. These were large forested and mountainous areas, including the Dandenong Range National Park, as well as the nearby Dungalla Forest. While these searches were prepared and conducted, police continued to examine the tips that they were receiving from the public. One of these tips concerned a brothel in an eastern suburb of Melbourne. The witness behind the tip said that they had seen a young Asian girl matching Bung's description a short time after her disappearance, inside the brothel. No real details have been released, but police examined this tip and said that it did not go anywhere. Some in the media began to theorize that Bung Siriboon had been abducted, and then perhaps taken outside of the immediate area, perhaps even outside of Australia itself. Rumors followed these theories to her birth father, who still lived in Thailand. But despite police reaching out to international agencies and federal police for assistance, these theories led nowhere. There was no proof that Bung had left the country, and her identity wasn't used to do so. A few weeks after the disappearance of Bung Siriboon, a couple of incidents sparked concerns throughout the Melbourne area. On June 21st, 2011, a 16-year-old girl from the nearby suburb of Ringwood claimed that she had escaped an abduction attempt in the afternoon hours of that Tuesday. The girl, who was a Caucasian, had been walking along the road when a man drove by in a blue sedan. He had stopped and tried to entice the girl into getting into his car, but she refused. The man in the blue sedan drove forward, before coming to a stop ahead of her. As she walked by the car, the man approached her from behind and grabbed her arm. She was able to fight, claw, and scratch her way out of his grip, and ran off and hid in some bushes nearby. The man drove off shortly thereafter in his vehicle, and the girl did not see him again. The driver of the sedan was described as being in his 50s or 60s, with gray hair, decayed teeth, and wearing dark clothing. The girl said that he looked and sounded Southern European, but no more details could be determined based on her short interactions with him. The location of this near-abduction, Ringwood East, was less than 10 kilometers from where Bung Siriboon had gone missing. However, many pointed to inconsistencies between the victims. Bung was a 13-year-old of Asian descent, and this girl was 16 and white. Not to mention that Bung had gone missing in the morning, while this girl had avoided a terrifying ordeal in the afternoon. The differences were notable. However, those differences were washed away when another near-abduction was reported a little over a week later, and much closer to where Bung had gone missing. That's after the break. On June 29, 2011, less than a month after Bung's disappearance, another girl claimed to have escaped a terrifying abduction attempt, this time in the town of Boronia itself. This alleged abduction attempt had happened just blocks away from where Bung had gone missing. The victim was an 11-year-old who was also of Asian descent and was actually familiar with Bung. The two lived very close to one another, and they actually knew each other. The girl reported the incident to police and gave a description of the man who had attempted to kidnap her. She said that he was an older man wearing a gray and red sweatsuit, who was wearing glasses and a surgical mask during the abduction attempt. Police would later provide a sketch of this culprit to the media, which is nightmare-inducing to say the least. The details provided by the 11-year-old in Boronia were also pretty consistent with the information provided by the 16-year-old in Ringwood, whose attempted abduction had happened just a week earlier. This case sparked a large amount of panic in the area, and parents now refused to let their children out of sight. The area was on the lookout for this terrifying kidnapper, who was likely involved in one or more additional cases. John Potter, a detective inspector that was working on the Bung case, spoke about these abductions possibly being linked. Quote, "We are looking at potential links between the recent reports of the attempted abduction in Boronia and the Bung case, and also recent reports of attempted abductions in the eastern and southern suburbs." Police continued to investigate this lead, and began to devote a lot of resources to this alleged abduction. After all, the setting and victim profile was almost identical to that of the Bung Siriboon case, and details provided from this alleged abduction could finally be the clues needed to solve the case. However, I only call this a quote alleged abduction because the 11-year-old that reported it to police admitted just a week or so later to fabricating the entire story. She admitted to her family and then law enforcement that the incident had been made up entirely. Now, police were back to square one. They could not successfully link the attempted abduction in Ringwood to Bung's case, and this promising lead had turned out to be nothing more than a hoax. Detective Inspector John Potter, who was frustrated about the investigation's lack of any serious leads, spoke to the press shortly after it was revealed that his department had been on a wild goose chase for over a week. Now, they were forced to admit that the Bung Siriboon case had gotten derailed. Quote, "We have no description of an offender. It is not connected to any other abduction attempt. We have no vehicle description, and we have no sightings since the day she went missing. It's as though she vanished into thin air." Following the failure to link the disappearance of Bung to any recent abduction attempts, those in the media began to move the possibilities back into the past, in particular to other cold cases from the area. including that of 13-year-old Carmen Chan, who was abducted from her Victoria home in 1991. If you are unfamiliar with the case of Carmen Chan, I encourage you to go back to one of the first episodes of the podcast, in which I discussed the cases linked to a culprit named Mr. Cruel. Mr. Cruel was an Australian boogeyman from the beginning of the 1990s, who police believe was responsible for 3 abductions throughout Victoria. His first 2 victims, Sharon Wills and Nicola Linus, were abducted in 1988 and 1990, respectively. Both were sexually assaulted and then abandoned in public areas. They had no idea who was behind the attack, but provided details that gave police the indication that their culprit was methodical and sadistic. Then, in 1991, Carmen Chan, the 13-year-old daughter of Chinese immigrants, was abducted from her home in Templestowe, a suburb to the northwest of Boronia. Her body was not found for over a year, at which point her case was linked to the other 2 abductions, perpetrated by this unknown Mr. Cruel. Because of the location and description of the victims, both Carmen and Bung being 13-year-old immigrants of Asian descent, their cases were linked in the public's eye. However, Carmen's abduction had taken place 20 years beforehand, and there was no indication that the mysterious Mr. Cruel was still active in the area. Steve Fontana, who had worked on the Mr. Cruel investigation over the years, was a participant in the investigation to find Bung's Siriboon, and he struggled to come to terms with the idea that they might be linked. Because so many years had passed with no known involvement from Mr. Cruel, he found it unlikely that Carmen's case, or Mr. Cruel, were tied to Bung's disappearance. Quote, "I personally don't think it's related, but we certainly wouldn't write it off." However, that did not stop the rumors from spreading. Over the years, Bung's disappearance has been indirectly linked to the Mr. Cruel investigation, a fact I mentioned at the tail end of my episode about that case. In August of 2011, a creek bed nearby Bung's family's home was searched, called Old Joe's Creek Reserve. The extensive 5-day search found several items. Unfortunately, none of them seemed to be related to the Bung's Siriboon investigation. John Potter, the previously quoted detective inspector, said about the search, quote, "There's no evidence she was there." Over the next 2 weeks, police would question over 500 people in Boronia itself, and a more thorough search was arranged in the area where Bung had disappeared. This search was conducted by SES, the State Emergency Service. Bung's family received some good news in October of 2011, when it was announced that a full task force had been assembled to handle the case. The first such task force assembled since 2003, Task Force Puma, which included 12 detectives and was headed by Homicide Squad Detective Senior Sergeant David Snare, was organized to work on the Bung Siriboon disappearance full-time. Detective Inspector John Potter, who had been working on the case for months at this point, was also included in the task force. Potter told the media, upon the creation of the team meant to find Bung, quote, "We hold grave concerns for her welfare. At this point, we've still got quite a number of active lines of inquiry as a result of information we've received, and we're hopeful that those lines of inquiry will produce the breakthrough that we're after. We're waiting for that one call, that one piece of information that will solve this case." Task Force Puma received more than 600 calls from the public within the first 6 months of the investigation, heading into the Australian summer months. In March of 2012, 9 months after Bung's disappearance, investigators received a call that piqued their interest. The details of this call have never been revealed, but police encouraged the caller to make contact once again, as their call had provided valuable information. It is unknown whether this caller ever did call back. At the tail end of 2011, police announced they had developed a solid lead, who had actually confessed to involvement in the disappearance of Bung Siriboon. In August of that year, police interviewed a 24-year-old man from the area who told police that he had information. He was arrested, but eventually released because police did not have enough information to continue to hold him. This young man was then re-interviewed again in October. Again, he was detained and arrested, but also again, he was released. This man told police that he had accidentally hit Bung with his vehicle on the morning she went missing, and he had then proceeded to dispose of her body at a local reserve. This is actually what had spawned the search of Old Joe's Creek in August of that year. Apparently, during both interviews, police heard him out and asked him to provide evidence of his wrongdoing. But when tasked with that, the young man could provide no definitive proof. Police followed him out to the reserve where he claimed he had buried Bung's body, but no evidence was found that she had ever been there. This young man's vehicle was seized during the span of the investigation, but once more, police could find nothing that pointed towards this young man's guilt. Because there was nothing definitive provided by this man, other than a confession which investigators doubted entirely, he was released. Law enforcement continued to name him a quote-unquote person of interest, but he has not been addressed by investigators in the years since. It has since been assumed that he was a bit of a nut who inserted himself into an active investigation for no real reason. In 2012, investigators stated that they had begun developing a second person of interest. Police Chief Commissioner Ken Lay told the media that this POI was, quote, entirely separate from the first suspect. No details about this individual have ever been released, but police have publicly stated that this man or woman has not been ruled out for involvement in the case. Detective Inspector John Potter said sometime later, and not too long ago, quote, that individual remains a person of interest. In addition to the persons of interest being raised by police, a suspect emerged in the media who was theorized to possibly have involvement in similar cases over the years. Robert Keith Knight was a sexual offender that had lived near Boronia during the time span in which Bung Siriboon disappeared. He had allegedly kidnapped and sexually assaulted 2 schoolgirls years apart in 1980 and 1996, although it was believed that he had committed other crimes between that span of time. In fact, one police official said that the odds of him not striking at all between 1980 and 1996 was, quote, infinitesimal. Knight's name emerged as one of the primary suspects for Australia's feared Mr. Cruel, and investigators, as recently as just a year ago, admitted that he was one suspect that they were never able to eliminate. Knight was arrested for a couple of sexual assault charges in 1997, and sentenced to a large prison bid the following year, 1998. He was then released from his sentence in March of 2009, putting him back on the streets of Melbourne in the time period in which Bung Siriboon went missing. In 2013, Robert Keith Knight was arrested for possession of what was described as a, quote, large collection of child pornography. This consisted of over 10,000 images, some of which Knight had likely been involved in producing. Knight was interrogated as a potential suspect in the Bung Siriboon disappearance that year, but was eliminated from the probe shortly thereafter. A short time later, Robert Keith Knight committed suicide. He leapt from an upper floor of the Melbourne remand center he was housed in, just hours before he was supposed to appear in court for charges related to his child porn collection. Knight was 62 years old at the time of his death, making him around 60 when Bung Siriboon disappeared. He also happened to drive a white Ford Maverick, which is somewhat similar to descriptions of a car spotted in the area around Bung's disappearance, but that's something I'll get to in a bit. Needless to say, I still consider Robert Keith Knight an interesting figure in this story, and even though police officially ruled him out as a suspect, I'd love to learn more about how they did so. Task Force Puma, which existed for 2 years, investigated over 250 registered sex offenders that lived in the area, searched over 1,000 homes, and collected more than 1,100 pieces of evidence, all of which police say proved invaluable to creating a portrait of Bung's disappearance. However, most unfortunately, still missing from that puzzle was the one missing piece. The missing piece, which could have helped investigators crack the case for good. One detective infamously told the media that the task force had collected, quote, a big bag of fresh air. In October of 2013, 2 years after its creation, Task Force Puma was dismantled. The open case of Bung Siriboon's disappearance was then handed off to homicide detectives. who had to now work on the case without the benefits that came with a task force. Ken Lay, the Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, spoke about this decision. He said that as much as it hurt him to say, there was no indication that Bung was still alive. Quote, "I wish there was, but that's not right. Although we can't completely close the door on that, we're probably in the space where we're fearing the worst." Commissioner Lay also stated that he did not see a reason for Task Force Puma to reassemble, and he viewed the investigation to be in a good spot moving forward. Quote, "The investigation has now been sharpened, so the homicide squad has picked it up. I'm confident we have the resources to get done what needs to be done." Detective Superintendent Tess Walsh told the media that the decision to end Task Force Puma had not been an easy one, but it was a necessary decision. Quote, "We've met with Bung's family and explained to them that the investigation is still very much active, and we remain committed to providing them with some answers." At this point, in October of 2013, Bung had been missing for over 2 years. She had been 13 when she disappeared, and would now be approaching her 16th birthday. In that time, a lot had changed in her family. Fred Pattison, her stepfather, had taken weeks off from his factory job to assist in the search for his stepdaughter. About a month later, he had to return to work, but was forced to amend his schedule. He could no longer work evenings because Bung's mother, Vanidda, had struggles sleeping on her own. Nid, as Fred called her, was heartbroken following the loss of her youngest daughter. She tried to seek peace in her Buddhist faith, but even that wasn't enough. By the 1-year anniversary of Bung's disappearance, Vanidda had returned to Thailand. She remained married to Fred, but she just could not handle living in Victoria any longer. Fred talked about this in an interview a short time later. Quote, "She went over there to get some solace with family and friends, to visit the temples, take her mind off of things. She just couldn't handle it here. Here was where everything had happened. Bung was the apple of Nid's eye. She and Bung were very connected, very close." Fred Pattison, Bung's father, stayed in Australia. He continued to live in the family's home on Elsie Street, and continued to speak to the press about the case. He had taken on the role of family spokesman following Bung going missing, and he continued to do so, urging those in the media to feature her story on news broadcast and such. With him staying in Australia, he was also able to support Bung's older sister, Pung, who was now going through university in Victoria. Some of Bung's friends struggled in the wake of their best friend's disappearance. Layla Preston, one of Bung's friends from Boronia Heights College, simply could not handle seeing her face on missing persons posters and billboards all throughout town. She ended up moving to her father's home in New South Wales to escape the pressure. Other friends felt the same, having to change schools or districts for their own mental health. The loss of Bung Siriboon had a profound effect on everyone that knew her, and all of them were struggling to adapt in her absence.
Now to the day's other news, and police have revealed they're now considering a reward in a bid to solve the mystery disappearance of schoolgirl Bung Siriboon. It comes as they ramp up their search for clues in bushland at Boronia.
In February of 2014, a $1 million reward was announced in the search for Bung Siriboon, as well as the possibility of immunity from any prosecution that may arise, depending on the information provided. Homicide Squad Detective Inspector John Potter, who continued to work on the case, addressed the media during the announcement. Quote, $1 million is a life-changing amount of money. Task Force Puma and Homicide Squad detectives have investigated more than 1,200 pieces of information since Bung went missing, but we are still missing that crucial piece that will provide some answers about what happened to her. We are not going to solve this on our own. We need the community's help. If you have any information about what may have happened to Bung on that morning in June 2011 and have not previously contacted us, please do so. It's been more than 2.5 years since Bung's disappearance, and we desperately want to give her family some answers and bring the person or people responsible to justice. Fred Pattison, who addressed the media shortly thereafter, spoke about what life had been like in the wake of Bung's disappearance. Quote, "It's like living in limbo. Plans get put on hold. Some days are a lot more difficult than others. You ask yourself, why? Why is it us? It doesn't get any easier. If anything, it gets harder the longer time goes on. It puts a lot of strain on everything. Everyone still misses her. It's hard to believe someone can just vanish off the face of the earth. We still believe she is alive. Every medium, card reader, or person that we believe and trust say the same thing. You get a gut feeling when someone passes by. We believe she's coming home. We can't believe anything else. We can't go about thinking negative thoughts. It's just a matter of someone coming forward and telling us what they know. In June of 2014, which marked the 3rd anniversary of Bung's disappearance, police released some information which they believed might yield some potential leads. The information was directly tied into 2 sightings, which had been reported to them in the early days of the investigation. Both sightings had produced descriptions of white vehicles, as well as the drivers of both. The first sighting came from Boronia itself, on the morning that Bung went missing. This sighting happened roughly 15 minutes after Bung had left for school, and involved a white Ford Falcon seen at an intersection along Boronia and Florestan roads. A witness recalled seeing a young girl, matching Bung's description, looking out the back window of the vehicle. The car, which was traveling east, was an EA to EF model, which would place the time period of the vehicle's manufacture between 1988 and 1996. The driver, as described by the witness, was a white man in his 50s or 60s who had brown hair, which was slicked back in a quote rock and roll style. The man also had tattoos along his arms, including a colorful tattoo on his upper left arm. He was reportedly wearing a blue singlet, but I'm not sure what to make of that. Detective Inspector John Potter stated about this sighting, quote, "We had a male Caucasian in his late 50s to early 60s driving with an Asian girl in her teens in the back seat. And according to our information, that didn't fit. There was something odd about that, so we believe it's worth following up. The sighting may well be completely innocent, but it is relevant to us and we need to investigate it." The second sighting of a white car came from an area further away from the setting of Bung's disappearance, closer to Rowville, an area roughly 12 kilometers south of Boronia. This sighting, which took place on Napoleon Road, happened sometime between 8:45 and 9 a.m., about half an hour after Bung had left for school that morning. The witness told police that they had seen Bung, or a girl matching her description, sitting in the front seat of a white station wagon, while cars made their way through traffic. The station wagon itself was described as a white Holden HQ Kingswood station wagon, which may have been a model from 1971 to 1973. The driver of this vehicle was described as being in his late 30s or early 40s, who was either bald or someone that had very fair, light-colored hair. This man also had neck and sleeve tattoos covering both arms, which police tried to emphasize to the area. Michael Hughes, another detective inspector for the homicide squad, spoke to the press about this lead. Quote, "There are 2 specific pieces of information we are asking the public to consider. The description of the male with a large tattoo on his neck, and the description of the white-colored station wagon. We are asking the public to think about anyone that may fit the description and had a similar vehicle or may have had access to a similar vehicle." June of 2016 marked the 5-year anniversary of Bung's disappearance. Her family, who had remained splintered throughout that time, continued to hold out hope for the safe return of their daughter and sister. Law enforcement, who had continued their investigation, insisted that they had no new information to share about the case. Vanidda Pattison, Bung's mother, still lived in Thailand. She said it was too hard for her to stay in Melbourne for any extended period of time. But she did return in 2016 to be there for her oldest daughter's university graduation. On the 5-year mark of Bung's absence, her stepfather, Fred Pattison, once again spoke to the media. Quote, "We still hope and believe she's alive. We have to. There is no evidence otherwise. It's a feeling in our heart. It's been long enough. We need information. We want information about our daughter, about our angel. We want to know good or bad. If anyone out there knows anything, or suspects anything, come forward and tell the police." One potential suspect that I haven't seen talked about in the media or in any statements from the family or law enforcement, is a man named Gregory Keith Davies. Gregory Davies was just one of several sexual offenders that lived in the area, in particular around Melbourne, and who had a history of violence. In 1970, Gregory Davies, then a young man, nearly murdered a 14-year-old girl. The girl, whom Davies admitted that he intended to rape, had been bludgeoned with a hammer and left for dead. Davies was later charged with attempted murder, but in the end was acquitted on attempted murder charges due to his defense of insanity. However, because of that defense and other charges, he ended up spending over a decade in custody before being released in the early 1980s. In 1984, the body of a 6-year-old girl named Kylie Mayberry was found in a Melbourne gutter, having been kidnapped, drugged, raped, and then murdered. Davies, then a recently released felon, was questioned by police. He seemed to have a solid alibi and was cleared almost immediately. The family of 6-year-old Kylie fractured as a result of the ensuing investigation. Both her uncle and grandfather, who were investigated and accused in the aftermath of the heinous crime, both committed suicide as a result. Her mother, Julie, ended up struggling with clinical depression and substance abuse over the next few decades, as the investigation languished. Gregory Keith Davies, on the other hand, was a free man. He was cleared to sexually assault or abuse several children over the next decade or so, as accused by several victims, who have now since grown up. They claimed that their families hesitated to bring forth charges against Davies because they were worried about their children having to testify in open court. In 1996, Davies was finally convicted for several of these sexual assault charges, which stemmed from incidents involving 6 different young girls. He went to prison for a little over 2.5 years, before finding himself on the streets as a free man once again. In 2016, Davies, then 73 years old, was finally arrested for the murder of Kylie Mayberry from over 30 years prior. Police had obtained DNA samples from Davies, and were able to link him to the crime scene. In 2017, Davies pleaded guilty to both murder and rape, and was sentenced to life in prison. His conviction, which gave him a minimum sentence of 28 years, assured that he would be at least 101 years old at the time of his release, all but guaranteeing that he will die behind bars. During the trial, Davies insisted that he did not remember kidnapping, drugging, sexually assaulting, and murdering 6-year-old Kylie. But then he later admitted that he must have done it, quote, because my DNA is a match to Kylie's killer's DNA. In July of 2017, another inmate that was in the prison poured a pitcher of boiling water on Davies' crotch, which required extensive skin grafts and procedures to heal. Gregory Keith Davies continues to sit behind bars, and I find him a possible suspect in this case, not only because of the setting and the victim profile. Davies did sexually assault several girls around the age of Bung and had a proclivity for violence, but also because he drove a white Holden, similar to the vehicle spotted by at least 2 eyewitnesses. And Davies, who would have been in his upper 60s at the time of the assault, might have even fit the witness description. It's impossible to tell whether or not Davies committed other crimes in the area, in particular between his release date in the late 1990s and his arrest in 2016, but I definitely think it's a solid possibility. Bung Siriboon is remembered not only in the Melbourne area, by those that have seen her face on missing persons posters or in news broadcast, but by the family and friends that miss her and have felt a gaping hole in their lives since she went missing. Bung's friends from Boronia Heights College, who were all in their early teenage years when she disappeared in 2011, have since grown up. They have graduated from high school and have since gone on to live adult lives. Boronia Heights, Bung's old school, shut down in 2015. It then merged with the area's primary school to form Boronia K-12 College. Bung, who would be in her 20s now, is remembered by her friends from Boronia Heights, who have tattooed her name and her birth date on themselves as an act of remembrance. A year or so ago, the friends gathered at Boronia K-12, the newly formed school, to remember Bung. The school had commissioned a plaque on their property, which is always illuminated to, as they say, guide her home. Layla Preston, Bung's classmate from grade 7, spoke about her missing friend. Quote, "Life goes on, but when I think about her, I feel so sad in my heart because I miss her smile and her laugh and her energy and her presence." Demai Hillard, Bung's oldest and closest friend from the area, says that she has struggled to find normality in her life since 2011. Quote, "I can't walk home by myself at nighttime. I don't take my dogs for walks anymore. I can't sleep in the dark without a light on. I've had counseling, but it doesn't help because there's no closure. It's agonizing not knowing where my best friend is and whether she's safe. And I really cannot imagine the pain her parents have gone through. They're heartbroken." It's true. In addition to the friends that had to either change schools or even move across Australia to escape the dark cloud of Bung's disappearance, her family continues to be splintered. Her mother continues to live in Thailand, returning for holidays and special events, but has a permanently fractured relationship with the area. Nid and Fred Pattison are still married, with the two taking trips to and from Thailand to visit one another, but their relationship was dealt a crushing blow when their 13-year-old daughter went missing over 7 years ago. Pong, Bung's older sister, has also grown up. She graduated from Swinburne University in 2016 with a degree in international business. She now has a life of her own, but Fred Pattison, her stepfather, said that she, quote, "isn't a big one to show emotions, but she's lost her younger sister. She misses her sister, and she's kept busy by putting herself through education." In 2016, Pong graduated from nearby Swinburne University with a degree in international business. Fred Pattison, Bung's father, has been at times both a suspect and the family's advocate in the media. Despite that though, he continues to live in the Elsie Street home that Bung disappeared from. Fred says that he's still holding out hope for his daughter to return home, but it gets harder to deal with every single day. Quote, "That's the hard thing. There's just nothing. It's like 1 minute she's there and the next she's gone. But you don't just walk down a street and vanish. Somebody knows something. They just need to have a conscience and come forward. We want to hear any information, even if it's bad. If you know anything, please do not refrain from making contact. There is still a $1 million reward for information that could lead to this case being solved, as well as immunity from prosecution. If you suspect or know of anything, please call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. That's 1-800-333-000. As of this episode's recording, the story of Siriyakorn, Bung, Siriboon remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to Unresolved. If you would like to support the podcast, you could do so by leaving the podcast a rating and review on iTunes or Apple Podcast. Those are always appreciated, and are like gold to independent shows like this one. If you would like to go a step further than that, you could head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to become a supporter of the show. There, you could also get access to podcast merchandise and bonus episodes, including one that I just put out, which is about a West Virginia coal miner named Walter Allen, who was convicted of treason in 1922. It's a really interesting story, so you should check it out. If you would like to stay in touch, you could find Unresolved on all of the usual social media sites: Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for Unresolved Pod, and it should pop up. There's also a Facebook discussion group, where we have some cool discussions about everything from true crime to music and stuff like that. Emails can be sent in to theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com, no spaces or dashes or anything like that, or to michael@unresolved.me, and as always, that's MICHEAL. Also, any voicemails or text can be sent in to 831-200-3550. Once again, that's 831-200-3550. Also, if you want any of this information, you could just head to the podcast website, which is unresolved.me. There, you could also find a written transcript of each episode, as well as sources for further reading, pictures, and much more. Anyhow, I will stop bombarding you with information. Hope you all found this week's episode fascinating, and I will hopefully be back with another one very, very soon. Take care, everyone, and I will talk to you later.